Recently, I was looking for some movie recommendations, and I stumbled upon this forum that was asking people how many times they had watched their favorite movie. One person responded that they had watched Shawshank Redemption over 50 times and even had a tattoo to honor it. Maybe you have a movie like that you can just watch over and over again. Or maybe for you it's not a movie, but it's a book that you can just keep on reading. And every time you consume this story, you just can't get enough. So I grew up in a Christian family, and we would read the Bible after every meal. Whenever we would get to the story of Joseph, my mom would stay seated at the table and read ahead, devouring the story as if she had never heard it before. And she would be moved to tears throughout it, and especially at the big part later in the end. But we would just smile and do the dishes, not really understanding what was so great about Joseph, but enjoying the fact that my mom loved him. In recent years, I've gained a much greater appreciation of Joseph and of his story. Maybe it is because I can relate to him a bit. Like Joseph, I'm quite sensitive and I cry a lot. Seriously, the Bible tells us 6 times that Joseph weeps. And you may not have noticed that, but I did in recent years. So, for example, in Genesis 43, verse 30, we read that Joseph became very emotional when he saw his brother and ran out to cry in private. And also like Joseph, I'm far away from my family in the Netherlands. And I can't just go back to see them. As opposed to Joseph, however, my siblings did not sell me here into slavery. And my parents don't think that I'm dead. So I've got that going for me, right? So we meet Joseph for the first time in Genesis 30. And his family situation is rather strange for our standards, but for that time it was not that weird. His father was Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham. And Jacob did not have one wife, he had 4. He was married to the sisters Leah and Rachel and their servants Bilhah and Zilpah. And all of them had kids, except for Rachel. For a long time she was infertile, until God remembers her and enables her to conceive a son, Joseph. Now, Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, and Joseph was Jacob's favorite child. Genesis 37, verse 3 tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. You may know that Jacob had done some smart things in his life and some dumb things. This one was definitely dumb. He did not keep his favoritism a secret. He was very obvious about it. So he made Joseph this very fancy robe that probably had long sleeves and reached to the ground, which meant it was quite hard to do work on it. It was a bit like formal wear. No one goes and mows the grass or scrubs the toilet with their formal wear on, with like a suit and tie or a dress and heels, right? Have you seen it before? Because I haven't. So giving Joseph this robe meant giving him the typical younger child treatment. You know what I mean there? He basically doesn't have to do anything. And of course, his older brothers are not impressed. The Bible tells us that they hated him and they could not speak one kind word to him. On top of all this, Joseph has some weird dreams in which his brothers bow down for him. And then he tells them about it, which of course enrages them even more. He's not only that child that is loved most by the parents, but he's now also that younger child that thinks he is the best. And that can be so annoying, right? Any older siblings here that can relate? Good. So one day, Joseph's brothers are off grazing flocks somewhere further away. And Jacob sends Joseph to check on them. When they see him coming, their jealousy rages and they plot to kill him. Talking about sibling rivalry. So, as the oldest, and thus, of course, wisest son, Reuben tones the plan down a bit. He suggests throwing Joseph into this dry well with the idea of rescuing him later when everyone's calmed down a bit. This later never comes. When Reuben's gone, a group of traveling traders passes by, and Judah suggests selling Joseph to them rather than killing him. So Joseph is sold into slavery. Now, the brothers need to cover their tracks, so they dip Joseph's robe in blood, and upon returning home, make their father believe that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. But they, and we, know that Joseph is on his way to Egypt. In Egypt, Joseph is sold by the slave traders, and he becomes a slave to Potiphar, one of the king's officials. In Genesis 39, verse 2, we read that the Lord was with Joseph and blessed him in all that he did. His boss notices this, as verse 3 and 4 tell us. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Let's pause here and think for a bit. Do you think Joseph knew that God was with him? The reason I am asking this is because we are told by the writer that God was with Joseph, but he's not quoting Joseph saying this. If you think about it, maybe Joseph would have thought the opposite. He went from living a carefree life as his daddy's favorite, from living a hard life as a slave in a country far away. And he was only 17. Rather than having his whole life, his whole future open before him, he was a slave. And maybe he would be for the rest of his life. How would you feel? I'd be pretty bummed, let me tell you that. But regardless of Joseph's beliefs about God's presence with him or his purpose in the situation, he works hard and he prospers. His boss notices that whatever Joseph does works out and puts him in charge. So maybe there's a glimmer of hope. Although in slavery, at least Joseph has a prominent position and a boss who likes him. So there might be some chances for him in the future. Or will there? In the following bit of the chapter, we read that Potiphar's wife develops a bit of a crush on young, handsome Joseph. And she tries to get him to have sex with her. Joseph refuses because he does not want to betray his boss and fail both his boss and God. This shows that he has some good morals. However, Potiphar's wife is unstoppable. Day after day, she tries to seduce him, but Joseph outright refuses to even be close to her. And one day, Joseph finds himself alone with her because all the other servants are gone doing something else. She grabs him by his clothes and tries to force him to sleep with her. Rather than giving in and taking the easy route, Joseph runs, leaving his cloak behind. Is that what you do when you encounter temptation? Just run? It is quite effective. However, it does not necessarily make life easy. Because there were no witnesses around, Potiphar's wife was able to lie and twist the story. She was able to frame Joseph. So when her husband comes home, she claims that Joseph tried to rape her and ran away when she screamed. Now then, the text says that Potiphar burns with anger and he puts Joseph in prison. Among commentators, there's a bit of discussion about Potiphar's anger, as it is assumed that he would have killed Joseph right on the spot if he really believed his wife. No matter the answer to this dilemma, though, the fact is that Joseph went from being a beloved son to a slave to a prisoner. I don't think you can get much lower than that. Where is God when things go hayward? Were we not told in the beginning of this chapter that God was with Joseph? Has he left him? Surprisingly, the end of the chapter reflects the beginning. Read with me. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So, in similar words as before, we are told that God was with Joseph and blesses him in giving him success in whatever he does. Can you believe it? That God is with you, blessing you, showing you kindness, even when life is going crazy? I believe that Joseph must have struggled with this question. He found himself as a slave in a faraway country, far away from family. I live in a country far away from my family, and believe me, it is hard at times. But despite all this, Joseph managed to work his way up to then be framed and unjustly imprisoned. In prison, he would have been isolated and lonely, and his situation must have never looked more hopeless. Because even after his promotion, he was still in prison after all. I don't know about you, but I would be pretty angry at God. I would say, yeah, thanks for this promotion, but why did you allow me to get here in the first place? I know that is what I would say, because I have said it before. Maybe you have too. For me it was, God, my study is going well, but the rest of my life is just falling apart. What is the purpose here? And maybe for you it's the other way around. You've got great friends, but you just struggle so hard in school, and no matter what you do, your grades are not going up. Or maybe you're all past school and studying and enjoying your career, but you just feel so lonely and just wonder if God is even with you. We don't read anything about Joseph's beliefs or prayer life here. We just know that despite everything, he still works hard and has good morals. Although, he is determined to not stay in prison forever. In the next chapter, we meet the baker and the cupbearer of the king. Now, these were two important people because they were responsible for what the king would and would not eat or drink. And I hope you agree with me that food is very important. Good. These two guys had to make sure the king would eat delicious and healthy food and not get sick, or worse, poisoned. So one day the king was angry at them for whatever reason and throws them in the prison that Joseph lives. Maybe he became sick after a meal and suspects the guys to have messed up accidentally or on purpose. One night, these baker and the cupbearer both have a dream, and with God's help, Joseph interprets these. The cupbearer's dream has a favorable outcome of restoration, but the baker's dream means that he will be killed. Both dreams will come true in 3 days, says Joseph, as he tells a bit of his own story and asks the cupbearer to remember him and help him get out of the prison. Will this be Joseph's ticket out? Unfortunately not. The cupbearer forgets him. Can you imagine? After years of slavery and then imprisonment, there finally seems to be a way out. Maybe for a while Joseph woke up every single day thinking, maybe today is the day. But nothing happens day after day after day. Have you experienced that? Maybe today I won't be bullied at school. Maybe this week I won't have a panic attack. Maybe this year will be better than last year. Because last year, I think that one counts for all of us. How frustrating is it when our hopes are crushed? Where is God? in our disappointment, in our struggles? Does he forget us, like the cupbearer forgot Joseph? By the time the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph, it is 2 years later, and Joseph is now 30 years old. So for 13 years of his life, Joseph has been a slave and a prisoner. 13 years. For Joseph, that was almost half of his life. For some of you tonight, that's basically your whole life. 13 years of being mistreated, of being in this dark and hopeless place. Sometimes we're lucky enough to be able to endure 13 minutes of struggle before we want to give up, because it is just so hard. So after those 13 years, the king of Egypt has some dreams that no one can interpret. Then the cupbearer remembers Joseph. He recommends him, and Joseph gets fetched from prison. Joseph is able to interpret the dreams, which predict 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And then Joseph recommends a strategy to get through those years, which Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, quite likes. And he decides to put Joseph in charge of the country. So imagine this, Joseph went from that lowest position of being a slave in prison to being the second highest of the country, with only the king above him. In the 7 years of abundance, Joseph stores up lots of food that would not only feed Egypt, but also the surrounding nations in the years of famine. This partially fulfills a promise that God made to Abraham, that all peoples on earth will be blessed through him and his descendants. One of the surrounding nations impacted by the famine is Canaan. This is the land where Joseph's family lives. Upon hearing that Egypt has food, Jacob sends his sons there. And when his brothers meet Joseph again, they don't recognize him, which makes a lot of sense. They remember him as a 17-year-old scared Hebrew boy, and now he is about 40 years old and the ruler of Egypt, so he probably looked quite much like an Egyptian. Joseph, however, remembers his brothers and he recognizes them. But he pretends that he doesn't. He decides to test their characters thoroughly to see if they have changed before he reveals himself to them. And when he does, his brothers are terrified because he could just kill them with the click of his fingers. He has the power. He's the second in the land. What Joseph does, however, is different from what we might expect. Instead of taking revenge, he reassures his brothers, telling them to not be upset or angry with themselves, because Joseph understands God's purpose. He declares that his brothers did not send him to Egypt, but God did. Later on, he says to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to save many lives." This does not mean that there was no harm involved, but that in the end, the result surpasses the pain. At the end of the story, Joseph's family moves to Egypt, where they basically live happily ever after. What a journey it has been, though. We're all on our own life journey, and I don't know how yours is at the moment. Maybe you're doing great, which is amazing. But maybe right now, you find yourself in a place, in a situation that just drags you down. You wonder if things will ever get better, and are starting to lose hope. You wonder what the purpose is and where God is. I am so sorry if that is your experience. You are not alone, even when it feels like it. God is with you, even when you don't experience it. He is working in the background, using your situation for your good and that of other believers. As Romans 8:28 promises us, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. All things, the good and the bad. Even when you don't experience it right now, God is there, working in the background. Joseph's life demonstrates God's presence and purpose. But do you think Joseph saw this when he was stuck in slavery and in prison for all those years? I'm not sure. I believe it is quite possible that Joseph may have questioned God just like you and me would have done. Or am I the only one that does that? If Joseph then did have a sense of purpose, did he see that the purpose surpassed himself? Because remember, God's purpose was not just to refine Joseph's character, but to save many lives in the long term. If the purpose was merely to refine Joseph's character, I don't think 13 years in slavery and prison were needed, right? A bit less would have done the job. But Joseph needed to be in prison to become known as someone who can interpret dreams by someone close to the king. And that is something Joseph realized and affirmed when he had this high position. The New Testament affirms that suffering builds perseverance, character, and hope. One promise I find encouraging is 2 Corinthians 1 verse 4, which tells us that God will comfort us in our troubles so that we can comfort others. I often don't see God's purpose in my situation, let alone his presence. When I struggle with homesickness, fears, or doubts, I often ask God, why did you bring me here, knowing it would be like this? I think someday I might understand, but not today. Today, I just have to trust. I have to trust that God is present and that God has a purpose. Because even when I don't understand the purpose or see God's presence, it doesn't mean God isn't there. Even when you don't see the purpose or see God's presence, it doesn't mean God isn't there. So in the meantime, like Joseph, I think we should try to work hard in the place where God has us and honor God in whatever we do, trusting that God has a purpose with our struggles. I invite you to believe that God is here and that he is working. Let's together be faithful in our current situation. Let's trust that God is with us and that he has a purpose for us, even when we cannot see it. Can I pray with you? Thank you. Our God, thank you for the stories in the Bible. Thank you that in these stories we can see that you have a purpose and that you are deeply present. God, thank you for the times that we experience that presence and that we just feel you with us and feel so loved. Tonight, I want to pray in particular for people that don't feel it, that don't experience it, for people that are just struggling right now. Please allow them to experience your presence and help them to hold on to you and have hope. Help us to see these people, to see what's going on, to see who needs to have a listening ear, who needs to have a hug, and help us to be there for them. Thank you, God, for your faithful love and for your active engagement in our lives. I pray that everyone here will experience your kindness this week. In Jesus' name, amen.